Welcome to the 6th session in this Advanced Research Design course. Today we're going to be talking about validity, particularly as this idea relates to qualitative research design for education master's students. I'm Dr. Sarah Black. Just to recap what we looked at in the last session, we began to think through how we will produce and process data, i.e. how we will analyze it. What sorts of things will we do when we go to the sites or the people that we want to include in our research? What types of goals will inform the decisions we make as to what we record, observe, or ask? And then what will we do once we have produced that data, taken it home, and begun to think about how we can both deconstruct and synthesize it using our research goals and our conceptual frameworks. We included in that discussion thinking about how we establish relationships with particular people that we would like to include in our research on an ongoing basis, rather than simply as in negotiating access at the beginning of data production, as well as what selecting sites and participant means and what kinds of questions this enables us to ask or not ask. We had a little bit of a talk about design types, ethnographies or case studies, life histories, other typical genres, if you like, of education qualitative research. And we discussed how there is no cookbook for research design. You can't just assume I'm going to do an ethnography, step 1, step 2, step 3. It really depends on what kinds of questions you're asking. We talked briefly about some of the common methods in qualitative research and how these might relate to design. But as I've said before, this course does not give you detailed instruction about how to conduct interviews, focus groups, observations, etc. We also had a brief chat about how living in the time of the COVID pandemic, when this course was designed and taught, will influence research design and methods, including how we think about obtaining access and negotiating access with sites and people, and the kinds of tools that we might use to conduct interviews or observations, as well as thinking about what limitations these impose on our methods, which of course relates to today's topic as well, of validity. And finally, we had a brief chat about things like analysis software for qualitative studies and what you're really looking for a software or system to do for you. Today, we're going to think through what validity is. And for my contact students, before this video and after the last one, there were readings from Maxwell regarding validity and validity threats and how this concept applies from a critical realist perspective to qualitative research design. We'll discuss the 5 types of validity threats that Maxwell offered in his 1992 paper. And we'll think through how these apply to some of the research designs that we've raised in this course. It's also worthwhile spending a little bit of time thinking about how validity relates to the other aspects of Maxwell's interactive design schema. How might validity issues affect your research questions, or your goals, or even your conceptual framework? Of course, all of this must relate back to your research question at the center of the interactive design model. And next session, we will see that it also all needs to be underpinned by questions of ethics. All right, let's start with our first objective for today. What is validity? At least, what is validity as it relates to qualitative research? Validity is when we want to be as sure as we possibly can, and whether we can ever be 100% sure is an ongoing debate between different philosophers of knowledge, epistemological philosophy. But we want to be as sure as we can that the observations we're making, the data we're producing, the things that we think we're seeing accurately or actually reflect or measure, record, describe the thing that we think it does. That is, we want to know that the method or the measure or the tool that we are using is valid for the task at hand. a small example, one might think of the IQMS system that is used to appraise teachers and their teaching in the South African public education system. It's also used for TVET lecturers. IQMS stands for Integrated Quality Management System. But anyone who has been subject to an IQMS process will tell you quickly that the measures of supposed pedagogical practice, quality, reflexivity, or professionalism that IQMS purports to reflect do not actually reflect what's going on in schools at all. That is, IQMS as a monitoring and evaluation tool has some serious validity issues for the object or phenomenon that it purports to be measuring. Let's have a think about some other examples. We've discussed previously in this course the idea of walking into a classroom and assuming that what you see as you sit at the back with your notebook or your laptop or your video camera on a tripod will be a typical lesson. Now, anyone who's worked in schools will be able to tell you flat out, it certainly can't be. The teacher may do their best to continue business as usual, but even subconsciously, they will necessarily be responding to your presence. And even if they are as cool as a cucumber, very calm and confident, and able to more or less do what they'd have done on any other day, you can bet your bottom dollar that the students will react. So what you can see when you go into a classroom, recording it with a camera, furiously scribbling notes, well, it's very hard to make an argument that you are witnessing a typical lesson. Another example. In South Africa, the vast majority of students are going to school, learning and being assessed in a language that is not the language they speak at home. In fact, for many students, it is their third, fourth, or fifth language. And language is a serious impediment to the quality of education that we are able to offer in our public schools. So when we ask students in South Africa to write a maths test, what are we really testing? Are we testing their maths ability? Or are we testing their language proficiency? And how could you tell the difference given that language mediates all communication? A third example. You witness a group of people attacking an animal, and you conclude, rather hastily, that they are cruel to the animal, or perhaps even more generically, they are cruel to animals overall. But there's a lot of assumptions, both descriptive and normative, built into what happened with the event that you observed and the conclusion that you drew from it. For starters, was the animal actually a real threat to those humans? If it was a man-eating tiger that had been plaguing a rural village without police support or any other kind of wildlife capture services for years, perhaps that's not cruelty, perhaps that's self-preservation. Was the animal a perceived threat? And, in fact, what do you mean by the word cruel? In fact, what do you mean by the word animal? Because I'd invite you to consider what happened to the last spider that got found in your house. Maxwell's point is repeated in multiple writings that he has published over many years on this topic, that there is no recipe for validity. There is no set of steps to follow to ensure that your methods provide concrete, irrefutable truth claims no matter what. Validity is part of the design of your research and how your methods relate to your question, your concepts, and your purpose. That is, validity is a property of the relations between these aspects of your design, and not just something that you can build into your methods as a kind of what he calls magic spell to ward off against bias or incredible or untruthful truth claims. Brunberg and McGrath in 1985 said, validity is not a commodity. You can't purchase it with techniques. It's rather like integrity, character, quality. That is, it's assessed relative to purposes and to circumstances. I'd add to that that, like integrity, validity can be a slightly slippery concept to grasp. So whether your methods of data production correspond to what you say they do, whether they're getting at the phenomenon that you want them to, well, that depends on what you're looking for. It depends on the concepts that frame your inquiry. It depends on the purposes and intentions motivating that inquiry. And it depends on the ontological and epistemological ground on which you are making those truth claims. Regarding that last point, I think that it's very useful to have a little bit of a rather oversimplistic discussion about how quite dominant ontologies and epistemologies regarding knowledge and truth claims have thought about validity and how they differ. Now, there are many, many more positions than the three I'm going to show you here, but in terms of education qualitative research, I think these are probably the three most dominant ones. They're also interesting because they set up, for those of you who are philosophy boffins, a type of Hegelian dialectic where you have a thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis at the end. And the three positions that I'm going to make broad brushstrokes and simplifications with are positivism, constructivism, and critical realism, or at least the positions that people take up broadly within these different traditions. So positivists would say ontologically, there is a real world out there, external to humans, and we can produce knowledge about it. We can get the most accurate account of that world by using our senses with the correct methods or methodology, which normally involves things like triangulating, being able to guard against bias, building in redundancy, or things like control variables, etc. And we mostly guard against bias, interpretive difference, or invalid descriptions, overgeneralizing or misreading a situation with what they call the right methods, which are normally, in the case of positivism, statistical. Now, this approach works for certain types of knowledge production. It works very, very well for medicine and for studying the natural sciences, even though, as we discussed in session 1, those types of knowledge production processes are themselves still located in a particular episteme or a particular, what Thomas Kuhn called, paradigm. So even those methods are still subservient to the categories of the people producing the knowledge. Nonetheless, positivists would say that they can get at least a very good approximation of the world using techniques like this. Constructivists would say that actually we can't, ontologically, we certainly can't know anything beyond what our flawed sensory data offers. In fact, that some extreme constructivists go on to say that there is no such thing at all beyond our understandings of the world, which is interesting when you think about the movie The Matrix. The Matrix was exactly premised on the idea that we can mistake reality for a construction of reality, and that we have no external way of differentiating between the two. Once you are inside the construction, it seems real to you as anything else. In the Maxwell reading for this session that I prescribe my students, he relates an old tale with a varied etymology regarding the world standing on the back of 4 elephants and 4 elephants standing on the back of a turtle that walks around the sun. And when asked what the turtle is standing on, the answer responds from whoever the interlocutor is in how the story is being related, that it's turtles all the way down. That is, one could have a matrix within a matrix within a matrix, a construction within a construction within a construction, and you certainly couldn't be able to tell the difference where you stand in the world with access to information that you have. So for a constructivist, all sensory data is constructed, is through mental schemas that we build up over time and experience, and also, of course, mediated through words and language, which is situated and specific. And so there is no better or more accurate description, since all knowledge is a product of construction. There's no reality outside of our constructed experience of it. Now, Tim Minchin, one of my favorite piano playing, rather cheeky, but somewhat positivist comedians, makes a joke in his beat poem Storm, wondering whether knowledge is so loose weave of a morning as whether deciding to exit one's home out the front door or from the second floor window. The point is, he's saying that we can actually get better or worse descriptions of the world, and we use our ability to distinguish what is better or worse knowledge to use in the world every day when we do things like walk out of our home every morning, or cross the road when a car is coming or when it isn't. That the world isn't just constructions, but there is something outside ourselves, and it has very real consequences. Positivism and constructivism are often portrayed in literature as fundamentally antagonistic to each other. And that's where the Hegelian dialectics idea that I mentioned earlier comes from. You have a thesis about what is in the world and how best to know it. You then have an antithesis, which takes the opposite position about what is in the world and how it can be known. And then you get, from the contradictions that emanate from those two positions, a third position, which is a synthesis of the two. And this is where the Maxwell readings come from, and certainly what I find the most plausible way of understanding what is in the world and how I can try to produce knowledge about it, which is a critical realist perspective. Now, a critical realist would say, look, there is a real world out there. Definitely, there's something outside, external to ourselves. Perhaps it's incredibly human-centric and heuristic to assume that the world is nothing but what we make of it. So there's a realism in terms of the ontological position. But we have to acknowledge that the constructivists have a point that we don't have a universal, omnipotent, omniscient gaze from which to account for that world. We have no flawless or perfect way of describing that world. So the critical realists accept the constructivist argument of what we call epistemological relativism, that our techniques for producing knowledge about the world are flawed and very human and subject to change. The critical realist camp, though, tends to also make the argument that there is rational judgment, that we can at least differentiate between better and worse ways of producing knowledge about the world, while still acknowledging the flaws and limitations of each, and that they all exist within the limits of our current understandings. And that comes back to the Minchin anecdote again. Can I tell where the front door is beyond what my eyes see and what my hand feels as the handle? No, I can't. But I do know that I want to walk out the front door and not off the top of the building. There are better and worse ways by which to exit my house. So this is a gross oversimplification of a very large field and debate regarding ontology and epistemology in philosophy. But it is useful to know that the Maxwell texts that we are drawing on for this course are located in the third camp, critical realism. That is, that there is a world out there that we can investigate, even if all we can at best produce is partial or incomplete accounts of that world. And as Maxwell says in his text, you don't need to keep finding the bottom turtle and find what it stands on. You can find a sturdy enough turtle to make your account about the phenomenon that you've studied credible. All right, out of philosophy land, and let's think a little bit more in concrete terms again. Let's think of a simple example. The room that you are sitting in right now, is it safe? Look around you. Wherever you are no doubt sitting in a very different room to the one I'm sitting in. So you will have a different answer to what I answer. Is it safe in the room that you are currently located in? But of course, even if we were sitting in the same room, we still would come up with different answers to that, because what do we mean by safe? Do you mean the room meets a certain regulatory checklist regarding health and safety? It has a fire extinguisher, clearly designated exit signs, adequate ventilation, lighting, etc. So what safe means is defined in a particular manner regarding a set of laws. Perhaps safety means that it poses you no physical imminent threat, that it's structurally sound, it's not going to crack, you're not going to get electrocuted by exposed wires, there's no gas pipes that are leaking and putting gas in the room that you're breathing without knowing, the ceiling's not going to fall on your head. So in this case, safe means a set of perhaps building standards, or at least some kind of a description that the room is not going to pose some imminent physical danger to its occupants. But what about if someone is sitting in the room who has harmed another person in the room? Could the victim of that harm argue that the room is not safe? If they had suffered some kind of mistreatment or abuse, would they feel safe with the person who hurt them present? Probably not. You could check the locks on the windows and doors, that the room has lots of food, a secured water supply. Perhaps what you mean by safe is that the room is able to withstand a zombie apocalypse. The point being that what safe is different in each case, and the methods that you would use to establish the room's safety would be different. You would never use a gas meter to detect the presence of abuse and abused and abuser in a room. That's just not a method that's valid for checking that type of emotional safety. Let's have a look at a matrix to think through this idea about what constitutes a valid measure of safety. If by safe you mean health and safety regulations, perhaps you need a checklist. But like my IQMS example earlier, that checklist might oversee a whole lot of other emotional or physical threats to the room's occupants that are not listed. So there you might have a problem where you have a theoretical validity issue or a validity threat that your health and safety checklist is incomplete or inaccurate for the problem at hand. Building standards. You could involve, for example, a stress test. If somebody walked into the room, a building inspector, and started just knocking on the wall with their knuckles, would you consider that a valid test of safety? Would you trust that person's evaluation of the room? An inspector walks in and says, yeah, it's fine, I can't smell gas, it's fine, it's fine. Would you trust that report? Or would you expect them to bring out a gas meter that checks for the most common types of gases or the gases that are piped around the city where you live, etc.? Emotional safety. How could you establish that the room feels emotionally safe? Well, you'd need to speak to people. You'd need to think about power dynamics. For example, lineups with the victims of crime are done with one-way windows, one-way mirrors, so that the participants in the lineup can't see the victim who is pointing them out. Think about the way that we run testimony in court services for minors, etc. And how that speaks to the validity of the testimony offered. When the person is making the difference between feeling like speaking their truth presents an imminent threat to themselves because the perpetrator can see them, versus feeling safe enough to point out the person who hurt them without fear of retribution. And it's quite nice to do a little exercise, as I do with my students, to say, well, what would constitute safety in the event of a zombie apocalypse? The point is that whatever methods you use depends on your definition of the concept safe, the context in which you are trying to operationalize your observation of that concept. And what you're trying to do is remove as much doubt from the reader's mind as possible that what you've done really gets at the thing you say it gets at. Now, Maxwell offers what he calls validity threats as a way of understanding the concept validity with origins in statistical and quantitative methods into qualitative ways of thinking about research. Rather than saying that I've done a validity check and I have all my dummy variables and I've done all my blind variables, etc., he says, well, what are the threats to validity? How could you be wrong? What are the things that might pose a risk or a gap or a potential oversight? So don't import validity as a concept from quantitative or positivist approaches. It means something quite different in qualitative work. You ask, how could I be wrong? And you can be wrong for different reasons. Taking one interpretation as the whole story is one way in which your account might not do justice to the phenomenon that you are trying to study. You can also be wrong by using an inappropriate theory for the question at hand. For example, if you took the idea of emotional safety as a criterion for safety when you were looking at building integrity, well, you've brought the wrong tool to the job. Now, Maxwell offers 5 different types of validity or validity threats that qualitative researchers should think about when they're conducting research and when they're coming up with research design. They are descriptive validity, interpretive validity, theoretical validity, generalizability, and evaluative validity. And this is a useful checklist I found to think against when you're trying to consider how your account of the thing that you are studying might be wrong. All right, let's think through each of those 5, and then we'll end with a little allegory that perhaps will make it easier for you to understand. Descriptive validity is about the factual accuracy of the account, that you're not making up or distorting the things you saw and heard. So one of the things that one might do would be to record an event if you can, whether that is tape recording an interview or video recording a lesson, so that you're not relying just on your memory or even the notes that you took, which might include, for example, some oversights or some omissions. Your hand can't write fast enough. The recording device enables you to go back to the event as much as you can. Of course, a recording device also has a point of view and might miss some things, but you're getting as factually accurate a recollection of things as you possibly can. If you can record from multiple perspectives, even better, because what you might miss on one camera or one device, you will capture on another. You might want to think about whether you are keeping the scope or frame of what you're observing or looking at too narrow. For example, if you want to watch a particular teacher teaching maths to grade 5, but you only ever observed the way that she interacts with the students, say on a Wednesday first thing, you might see that that looks like a very calm or a very particular type of lesson with a very particular structure. You walk in on a hot Friday afternoon in summer and you see something very different. Same teacher, same room, same students, but it's Friday and everyone's tired. So when you're observing a particular phenomenon, you need to think about whether the data you're producing actually represents accurately that phenomenon in its entirety. If you're doing interviews, transcribe the whole interview and not just parts of it. Check that transcription with the person that you interviewed, that it's accurate, that it does indeed reflect what they said and what you said. And consider, for example, the following illustrative case. The description: the student threw the eraser across the room. An event caught on camera. Versus, they said the student threw the eraser across the room. Not caught on camera, but it could be. But now you're relying on a second-hand account of the event. And so you're relying on someone else's interpretation or recollection. Or the student assaulted the other student with the eraser by throwing it. Now all of a sudden, there's an interpretation here where you need to say, hang on, was it an assault? Was it playful? Was it a joke? So interpretive validity, which is where we're going next, you're describing something with a normative slant on it, which might actually not be the most accurate description of what happened, because you are smuggling in there a judgment about the motivation of the student who threw the eraser. Which leads us to interpretive validity. Maxwell writes, qualitative researchers are not concerned solely or even primarily with providing valid descriptions of physical objects, events, behaviors, and the settings they study. They're also concerned with what objects, events, and behaviors mean to the people engaged in and with them. So we're very interested in people's accounts of their practices and their activities, how they understand the world, how they interpret the world. And so interpretability is about whether your account of those meanings, those values, or those particular perspectives, those are all cognitive constructs, are in fact representing the interpretations of the people that you're studying, and whether those are different from your own interpretation of what happened. You can see how descriptive validity and interpretive validity are not always easily or clearly distinct. But even if you disagree with the interpretations of your participants regarding certain events or phenomena, you still need to try and reflect their interpretations as faithfully and ethically as you can. And this is where that descriptive normative line can get a little bit tricky, but also very, very important. Let's think about an example from some of the previous sessions we've done regarding maths teachers' beliefs about language. Even if I disagreed with my maths teachers that mathematics is some kind of a platonic truth in the universe to be discovered, I still needed to reflect that that's how my teachers thought about it. And I needed to try and suspend my judgment that that account of what mathematics is not accurate. I believe in a sort of sociocultural or constructivist type of mathematical ontology. Another more tricky example, corporal punishment. You study in corporal punishment in a school where it's practiced. You know that it's legally not allowed, and you ethically yourself do not believe that corporal punishment is in any way justified. But you are trying to understand why the people who use corporal punishment continue to do so. And so imposing your interpretations of corporal punishment on them is in fact going to be deleterious to the purpose of your study, namely understanding why they do it. Now, theoretical validity is often one that students struggle to wrap their heads around. Maxwell says that there's two major differences between a theoretical understanding and the previous types we've discussed, namely description and interpretation. The first is the degree of abstraction of the accounting question from immediate physical and mental phenomena, all right? And so we're going beyond just a concrete description and interpretation of a particular event or object, and we're actually saying, are the conceptions, are the categories, are the words that we're using appropriate for the question at hand, or that we're developing during the study, do they need to be refined? Let's think back to our example where we're talking about the concept safe. When we were exploring different interpretations of the word safe, we were actually looking at theory, our theory as to what constitutes safety, and the effects that that might have on our methods and our interpretation of particular phenomena. Now, theory can refer to physical events or mental constructions, Maxwell continues, and it can incorporate participants' concepts and theories, but you're going beyond just describing perspectives. You're going to the idea of causality, a theory of change, or a fundamental worldview or value. So a theoretical understanding refers to account's function as an explanation, as well as a description or interpretation of the phenomenon. He goes on to say that a theoretical validity can have two components to it, a construct validity. Have you actually defined a concept that is a useful one or one that bears out in the world? And number two, does it offer any explanatory value? Let's think back to our example with animal cruelty. What is meant by an animal? Do you include insects in that, for example? Would you include corals or some of the other kinds of critters that you might inadvertently damage when you walk into a rock pool? You stand on a sea anemone or poke an urchin. That's technically an animal in biological terms, although most people don't think of it as such. What is meant by cruel? If you speak to anyone who's a dog trainer, there's an enormous diversity of opinions as to what constitutes training and cruelty. There are laissez-faire positions, which is that one should never control the dog's behavior, positioning all forms of domination or control as cruel, all the way to the other extreme, where the dog is treated brutally for any infraction of its behavior, and in between. But you'll be hard-pressed to find a line between those two extreme camps where you can differentiate between cruelty and not cruelty. It all depends on your construct of cruel. Explanatory validity, however, asks whether the concept you're applying to the phenomena that you're studying is in fact the right one to apply. So thinking about our example where we said, what if the animal is an imminent threat to humans? Is cruelty the only explanation for what you're seeing? Or could there be another concept that also needs to be brought into your conceptual framework as an alternative explanation that is equally plausible? Remember that validity is about asking, how could I be wrong? Applying the wrong concept for understanding what you're witnessing is one of the ways that you can be wrong. So in essence, theoretical validity is about whether you've brought the right tool to the job. You wouldn't want to bring a microscope to examine an elephant. You wouldn't want to bring historical materiality theory to questions about discourse, unless, of course, you're able very well to show why it is appropriate. It is about the appropriateness of the tool to the job. Just a reminder, we saw an example of bringing the wrong tool to the job when we looked at the Buthelezi paper just before session 3. Now, generalizability is another import from positivist or objectivist approaches to knowledge production. And it does mean different things again when it comes to qualitative work. In essence, you're asking whether what is accounted for in the research applies elsewhere. It's rare that small-scale qualitative studies, bounded accounts, for example, of case studies, etc., can be generalized, external to the particular phenomena being investigated. Mostly you'll find that the contribution that is generalizable is a conceptual one or a methodological one, and even that comes with caveats. The selection of data production sites, times, and participants in qualitative work, this is not about statistical inference to larger populations. Although there's a session in this course in the contact mode where Prof. Rudy Lauch talks about a quantitative study and what external validity means in that study. But for qualitative work, it means about selecting appropriate data that is coherent with the question, goals, and concepts, and provides a description that is internally coherent. We're interested to know if the data you produced tells us about that case in terms of where you could walk back into the same place or the same practice or the same phenomena, and the account offered in the study would resonate unless there's been significant changes since the study occurred. And finally, Maxwell offers us the idea of evaluative validity as a threat to consider. And that's when you're making a normative judgment about better or worse, right and good versus bad and wrong. And it involves the application of an evaluative framework that includes, often in qualitative research, some kind of an intervention. It's very much about casting judgment on behaviors, beliefs, and activities, which is why one really needs to be very, very careful with it, especially if what you have is a partial or incomplete account. Now, evaluative criteria will always be debated, and so you must make it clear to your reader what are the criteria against which you are evaluating a particular phenomenon. And that means you need to watch out for tacit normativity. For example, again, our animal cruelty scenario that we discussed earlier. Do you remember back to the Buthelezi paper where the claim was made that the students are not able? Now, that's tacitly normative. And it slipped in because the other parts of the design cohesion were not in place. Once again, think back to corporal punishment as well. Very hard not to make normative judgments about corporal punishment as a practice, but you need to be very clear about what those judgments are premised on. This might all seem very abstract, but I think there's a very nice little allegory that most people in the world can absolutely relate to that explains all 5 types of validity threats incredibly well. And that is the practice of refereeing or umpiring in sports. Most people around the world like some kind of a sport. So I hope that this resonates for a vast majority of the audience. Descriptive validity is about creating as accurate an account of what happened as possible. And we use a lot of methods in sport to try and capture the events from all sorts of angles. We have slow rewind playback. We have multiple camera angles. Even in Formula One, you'll now see that there are drones with cameras flying over the track, which are able to get previously undreamt of camera angles that record events as they happen. And particularly when an accident happens, that data footage is incredibly valuable. In football, we have goal line technology. In cricket, we have Hawkeye to establish where the LBW is based on what is happening on the field, and the umpire sees it in a split second and relies on memory. So can we document as accurately as we can from multiple perspectives what actually happened? Then there's interpretive validity. How do we understand what happened? Even when you have all those camera angles, even when you have frame by frame technology, a third umpire, etc., an off-field umpire, there's still deliberation. You'll see the ref on the field in the rugby game, in the football game, the umpire on the field. They all now have earpieces and they're conversing with their colleagues. They're discussing, what did you see? What did you see? How do you understand that? Does that seem right to you? They're trying to figure out how to interpret the events. Theoretical validity relates to the rules that we use in sport to classify fouls, fair play, goals, valid plays, etc. So you can see how it's also a lovely example, because you can see how what happens, the actual events that are witnessed and documented and observed in sport are in a dialogue with the rules. Rules change, often to keep up with changes in the game. All right, for example, what was once considered fair play in rugby is now considered dangerous. The concept of high tackling didn't exist when I first started watching rugby as a child, and now it does. And of course, then you will have cameras on the tackle event, multiple umpires all looking at it going, does that constitute a high tackle? Yes, it does. But the concept of a high or dangerous tackle, in football, it exists as well, or running on the pitch in cricket, etc. These are new. They didn't always exist in the rules forevermore, and the rules adapt and change depending on how play evolves. There are new categories of play. In rugby, they don't now just refer to scrums, they also refer to rucks and mauls as different types of play and stages of play. Or in cricket, when you're doing limited overs cricket, you'll see that the first 10 overs now, the field placement of how the bowling team's allowed to place its fielders are restricted in order to try and add some excitement to the game. So rules are not always necessarily about fair play or player safety, but they can also be about the audience's enjoyment of the game. And that, of course, relates to how sport is commercialized for advertising revenue. So now you can see how concepts or rules relate to the purpose and still relate to the methods about how we adjudicate events in a game of sport. Generalizability. I mean, do decisions from other games or between other teams inform how we understand this game? How do umpires and referees draw upon precedent? At what point does an event in a game have ripple effects across the whole sport and not just within the limits of that game? And evaluative validity is also very relevant for sport adjudication, because of course we are making normative judgments all the time as to what constitutes a goal. Was that foul play? Is that fair? Is that good and right or not? And we might invoke things like good sportsmanship or safety, etc. But can we make a judgment call? And if so, based on what? If you've ever watched post-match debates about the bias of an umpire or referee, you'll know that what constitutes a valid evaluative judgment is often highly contested. You know, the media will go on about biased refs, etc. But all of these apparatus within sport are an attempt to shore up the validity of the truth claims made by the decision makers on the field. And if you've watched sport, you'll know that they are far from fail-safe, but they work 99% of the time. The decisions that the umpires or referees make are considered credible and trustworthy for the most part. Let's revisit Maxwell's interactive research design and think about how what we've talked about here with validity relates to the other aspects of the design. I'm sure you can now see how it starts to backwash against the other parts. The definitions of your concepts, the methods that you use to describe and record the phenomena that you observe, even the very research question itself. We're going to look at a few examples as we wrap up the session. If I think back to my own PhD, I had a concept on rhythm. It was grounded in the theory of rhythm analysis from Henri Lefebvre. And my literature review gave me a few ideas about how other people had applied this so that I could try and develop a valid way of getting at rhythm, because rhythm is not something that's very easy to observe or document or record. How did I do that? Structured and unstructured observation over a prolonged period of time. I had a template for checking classrooms for rhythmic use So I would try and make sure I had a comprehensive and systematic way of documenting the same data day after day after day, looking for that rhythm, looking for a pattern of behavior and activity. And I also had a template for recording other aspects that I could cross-reference there for things like the time of the year, the day of the week, the time of observation, weather, other factors that basically I thought might influence the rhythm of activity at different levels in the school, at the level of the classroom, at the level of the whole school, etc. Validity threats while mistaking a specific moment for the general rhythm, not noticing that rhythms play out at different scales across the day, week, term, or season. And of course, the challenge of not being able to see the whole school at the same time. Now, how did I address these validity threats? Well, I spent as long a time as I could at each school, making sure that I varied my observations across the day, weeks, and terms. The observation was for a minimum of a term. I made sure that I distributed the times of observations across my different schools. And I also tried to use multiple sources of data to cross-reference the concept of rhythm with empirical data. So not just using what I could see, but also using freehand notes against my observation schedule. And I thought quite nicely using multisensory data. So the sonic scape of the school, how did the school sound, the scraping of chairs, etc. And also olfactory senses, the smell of the school. You knew break time was coming because you could smell the tuck shop. Another example, an analysis of the open learning policy framework. The concept was a theory of change or the logic about cause and effect that is evident in the document. And the theory is informed by critical discourse analysis, drawing on Foucault and Fairclough, looking at other scholars who have worked with these particular theoretical concepts and operationalized them, Patty Silbert, Francine de Klerk, Stephen Bull, and others, and used a critical discourse analysis to closely analyze the whole document, pulling out every instance of a particular word or a particular idea, coding it methodically, relating it to documents that informed other particular relevant policy statements. For example, commissions of inquiry, the white paper, the post-secondary education and training white paper, the Constitution, the National Development Plan, etc. Didn't use the NASCA in this particular case, actually. Now, the problem was reading the document and seeing what I wanted to see. That I had, in my mind, a particular normative set of values, which was antagonistic to this document. And so cherry picking and seeing what I wanted to see. And so I had to stop and deliberately ask myself, what are all the positive discourses that I might be overlooking because of picking out the negative ones? On what premise am I deciding whether a discourse is positive or negative, etc.? So interpretive validity, trying to justify my own interpretations as well as checking for alternative interpretations of the document as far as I could. Looking for internal consistencies was another way of trying to address this validity threat, looking for multiple interpretations, trying to look at primary and secondary text to substantiate the claims I was making, and doing a total analysis of the document, avoiding cherry picking or lifting out extracts. The third example is back to that master's course regarding espoused and enacted beliefs of teachers. Very difficult to get at. You can't see a belief, you can't smell it, you can't taste it. And so one would construct beliefs of teachers from their responses to a hypothetical problem from a textbook, from how they acted in class, from simulated recalls about how they described or understood their own actions in class. Validity threats was that what people say and what they do might be different, or that what they tell me and what they really think might not be the same. So that's an interpretive validity problem and a descriptive validity problem. So stimulated recall interviews was an opportunity to clarify a researcher's interpretation of events so that I didn't assume that the gap between what they did and what they said was down to cognitive dissonance, when it was just down to a misunderstanding on my part. And of course, the example I'd given before, rather than asking for a typical lesson, which I could never get, rather I asked for an artificial lesson, what they considered the best, and how they responded to that request was for me very interesting. And that involved changing the object of my analysis. So how would you write about validity in a research proposal? Well, these 5 categories help you structure that section. You can address each one by one. Some might not relate to your study, but then you should say so. If they do relate to your study, you should say how your design method identifies, mitigates, or circumnavigates that validity check. Do you remember our example earlier where we talked about a building inspector who didn't have a gas meter and just said, well, I can't smell gas? You wouldn't have found that to be a trustworthy or valid evaluation of the safety of the room. And in the same way, you need to convince your reader that you've done due diligence, that you've brought out your equivalent of a gas meter to check the thing that you need to check. When you needed to bring in an extra tool or perspective or check, you went and you got it. You didn't just ignore the problem. So qualitative research often refers to this concept of trustworthiness. Why should your reader believe your account? And the more you can demonstrate that you have thought seriously about how you might be wrong, the more trustworthy your account will seem. Finally, I'd just like to make the point that establishing a valid account is an ethical imperative too. Because if you're going to make truth claims, your validity becomes an ethical concern. If you offer an account that does not accurately describe what went on, or does not give adequate weight and attention to participants' worldviews, prioritizing your own, if you create categories and inferences that misrepresent the situation, if you overstretch your claims inappropriately, i.e. you try to generalize them into contexts or places where you are packing in more than they can carry, or if you're making normative judgments about a person without transparency as to the methods and criteria against which you are measuring them, you're performing an epistemic or symbolic violence upon that person, especially considering that they agreed to participate in your study. You are effectively doing an injustice, I would argue, because you are causing harm by misrepresenting things. We'll look at this more in session 8 of this course. Thank you so much for watching this session about validity as it relates to qualitative research, particularly thinking about education at the master's level. Don't forget, if you're still in a place where there is COVID floating around, to wear your mask, look after the people around you, and I'll catch you next time.